Welcome to Next Gen VC, a podcast from Gen Zs to Gen Zs. We aim to be the transparent window into the mysterious world of VCs and startups through the authentic conversations with the very individuals that make them. For this episode, we are joined by Francesco, founding and managing partner of Silicon Roundabout Ventures. Silicon Roundabout began as a community of 15,000 founders and engineers who love DeepTech. Today, Francesco invests in the most promising founders within his community through the Silicon Roundabout Venture Fund, primarily focusing on post-MVP, pre-seed and post-commercialization seed teams. Francesco will be sharing why he's so excited about DeepTech and why he thinks many traditional funds are afraid of investing in early-stage DeepTech startups. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the follow button and give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram at NextGenVCPod for updates on the latest episodes. Are you tired of always hearing about Silicon Valley VCs and not knowing what the greats of European VC are thinking? Well, no more. Head over to the EuropeanVC.com, the go-to place for everything European VC. You'll find podcasts, events, and expert-curated content from all over the EUVC scene. Well, what are you waiting for? Go to the EuropeanVC.com now.
Welcome to the podcast, Francesco.
Thank you guys for having me.
It's great to have you on board. And to start off, would you be able to tell us a bit more of your background and what Silicon Roundabout is and how it all came about?
Yeah, sure. That's a nice pun right there, how Silicon Roundabout came about. So I'm a software engineer, and I am from Italy, if you can probably guess from the Super Mario accent type of thing. But basically, I came here because I come from a very tiny village, about 20,000 people or something more than that, I don't know. And for my child, I mean, it's a beautiful town, but, I was a technologist, and you guess what's happened later is that I wanted to explore getting into the industry, and London was the perfect scenario. So then coming over here, I had to build my career, and I was always passionate about innovative technology. So what I started doing was to go around meeting people, and through this journey I met a person who would become my community co-founder, who has started this meetup with this other friend of his that I met. Then this person left the meetup, and we just grew the meetup, all bigger and bigger over time. And it's never been a business. So to answer, what is Silicon Roundabout and how it came about, it started out as literally a meetup on meetup.com near the old street roundabout, hence the name. And it just grew from there. And only around 2016, we started to do the first startup competitions, basically getting startups together, having them apply to present their companies, and then selecting what we felt were, the sort of craziest and ideas that could actually turn into unicorn, and kind of recreating the Silicon Valley vibe or the New York vibe here in London. And it's always been something that we kept doing as a passion project on the side. Paul was running a startup, and I was growing my career in software engineering. And that's basically, how the story of the community grows. It just kept spiraling in size from there, but it's never really been any more than a community of getting people together. Yeah, and that was until COVID, when I was finishing a contract role that kind of forced me to decide what's next in my career, because, I was just coming to the end of it. And COVID hit, and I was thinking, what's going to be next? And I wanted to do something with the community. Paul and I wanted to do something with the community, and that's where the idea came of launching a fund. So whilst he took over sort of the reins of running more the business side of the community to try and expand, also to make it more active, I took on the leadership of managing what it would become a fund, started making some angel investments. 2021 was done the validation process, and at the end of last year, we got the first commitment from a large VC that actually wants to invest in our smaller, emerging manager type of fund. And here I am today, trying to put together the last pieces to actually deploy capital. We've started to make some investments actually, but that's still sort of, pre-fund out of our own money. And then as soon as the fund launches, we'll transfer that into the portfolio and then grow from there.
That's really cool. And maybe for some of our listeners that aren't as familiar with Silicon Roundabout, who is part of this community and how did you first get them on board beyond the meetup.com?
Yeah, the majority of people at the meetup are founders engineers and startup operators, and they started to come literally just signing up on meetup.com. And that was it. And it was about putting up events. Throughout the years, locations changed. I guess the most iconic, just because of staying there for a long time, was around this sort of 2016 to 2018 period, was perhaps Google Campus, which now shut down in Shoreditch. But before that, like I said, we went other places always in the areas, from pubs to accelerators and other community hubs. And then, we settled the campus until COVID. Now it's not there anymore. So I don't think the last event we had a couple of days ago was again in person after 2 years. And it was a Hacker Tree, which is again another working space that kindly offered us their space to regroup again in person. And that's the community back again on track.
Amazing. I mean, there's a lot of communities nowadays, but sometimes they only last for a year or even much less. What about Silicon Roundabout do you think made it last so long, especially through COVID?
COVID was challenging because, it forced us to rethink. We kept putting content out there, but it wasn't the same. I mean, even this last event, the good thing is that we now have also an online audience. I guess it also forced me to start to use social media for once, at least, LinkedIn and Twitter, which means that now people can follow us a little bit more. But on the other hand, it was challenging. I guess one answer is, number one, the passion. I mean, like I said, Paul and I have been doing this alongside our careers before. And, we were doing our own thing, and then we still did it. We still organized the event, and people kept coming. So there is always almost a core, I guess, part of people that keep coming, and then there are others that maybe come, they explore, they stay, then they come back later. I think as long as there is the determination to wanting to keep meeting up and keep organizing DeepTech events, whether it's hardware like last event, or whether it's data science, whether it's logistics, it's finding interesting startups. Startups come because they want to connect to the ecosystem, and then the ecosystem responds back because people want to see these companies present. And then from there is just also the networking element, which I think is just keeping it alive. As long as there is the willingness from us to keep organizing events, more startups will be formed, and more founders will want to present, and more people will want to see what's next, for the future. What's the next coolest technology that's going to change your lives?
And it definitely sounds really, really exciting. And it must be nice to be back in person again after such a long time of online. And forging connections in person is very different to doing it in a virtual context. But what would you say has kind of been the biggest challenge you faced in kind of building this community, especially because you've been going so long and you must have faced a lot of hurdles at points?
Yeah, I think I would say two challenges. One was the fact that because it was always kind of this great passion project, which has the pro of being independent, it has the cons of never really managing to be, it always basically never becoming self-sustaining, in the sense that, we always have to sort of go back and push as the organizers to make it happen and keep it together, rather than creating a business that can be self-sustaining and therefore hiring people and growing beyond the actual community. And then the second challenge was that when, like I said, because of where I was in my career, where Paul was in his career, we decided to sort of look back and do something with this community and take it forward. And we wanted to help the DeepTech startups. The second challenge was that any easy, let's call it easy business model that just revolves around the community would effectively make us either a recruitment company or an event agency or a conference company or whatever else, like driven by sponsorship, or maybe because again, I'm a coder, I could have built a tech platform that could have connected investors to startups. But then all of these would not answer the problem we wanted to address, which is helping companies that are actually doing real innovation, if you want to call it deep tech, because today it's a term that people understand, but even before deep tech was a name, advanced technologies, right? And there has been historically little appetite for these companies from traditional investors, even angels. Now things are starting to change, but they started to change at growth stage, and it's slowly trickling down at the earlier stage. It's still very hard for, say, a hardware company or a edge computing company with no revenue to raise money that can propel them. And so because of that, in the end, we landed on doing the fact, which is extremely challenging as a business in itself. And I guess this kind of relates back to the question. The first challenge was how to make a business to make the community grow and make it self-sustainable. And the second question is, how do you make a business that actually resonates with you and is not just selling tickets just because it makes revenue, or become a platform that is going to serve the same investors that have the same mindset and then therefore end up funding breweries maybe rather than deep tech startups.
Why do you think there has been this shift in perspective of more and more funds being interested in deep tech? And actually, maybe taking a step back, what do you consider as deep tech?
Good, very good question. Because again, I personally don't even like the word because I had to use it because the first time, this is actually a funny story. So I'm part of this, it's basically a group of other founders that come together almost in an acceleration. It's been kindly put together by Founder Institute. It's called VC Lab, and it's basically been a useful group to compare ideas and get some strong feedback from people like the Founder Institute founder, like Ade or Mike and his team. And the first thing that they asked me to sort of teach them their thesis was, I want to launch a fund that invests in advanced computer science, hardware, and material science. And they were like, no investor, no LP will understand that. You invest in deep tech. So then, okay, I invest in deep tech. But deep tech for me, in our particular community in view, means advanced technologies in computer science that don't rely on vanilla off-the-shelf third-party technologies, or they're developing their own proprietary hardware, or that they use materials in science and physics. I also consider personally anything about drug developments, deep tech and biotech. However, I personally don't know that space, and we don't invest in that space, and the community doesn't really cater for that space, just because it has its own bubble and world, and there are certain people that it's kind of its own ecosystem. So even though I would define it as deep tech, I think there is a very different division, sort of split between the biotech advanced technologies and hardware and software kind of side of things.
That's definitely something which is quite interesting in terms of, your perspective on deep tech. If you had gone back 5-10 years ago, a lot of people were getting very excited about the word AI. And today its applications, are endless. But would you consider AI in what the general public tend to see it as deep tech? Or would you say it's just, another type of technology which society has got used to adopting in other formats?
Well, I think there is a lot of marketing and semantics, and I guess going back to sort of what Audrey actually was saying before, why there is so much interest. I think there is interest in general for either people sort of seeing something picking up, because maybe they have some insider knowledge, or they just genuinely believe there is a trend, and other people following the trend. And I think unfortunately there is always this hype around new things, which is in a way a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, because I think it can create much false expectations and driving people to the ecosystem for the wrong reason, which ultimately might also create a problem for startups, because sometimes startups, if they hit the hype cycle, they raise money and then they don't have customers to validate. And there is only so many rounds you can fake on the hype. And so in terms of AI, for example, again, it's mostly about semantics. What do you consider artificial intelligence? When I studied computer science, I studied machine learning. I looked at algorithms to apply certain types of curve fitting, or you look at various algorithms, and then only later I started to realize that people call all of that stuff AI. Then you might include, I don't know, genetic algorithms into that. There are other things that are not machine learning, and it's all about what do you define. What do you believe it to be? Is it what Wikipedia says? Is it what that computer science textbook says, or is what that VC says? Just because they invested. And I think in that respect, deep tech might be going through the same cycle. The difference, though, is that whilst AI, just in general term, it's kind of been applied to everything. And then when you go into dig down into it, only certain companies actually develop their own unique algorithms, whereas others are just basically taking TensorFlows and just like using vanilla off-the-shelf open source code and just running some data stuff on top. I guess you just need to find the line. What do you personally believe to be an advanced technology company? How much it created its own data moat using its own acquisition of data, which is why, ultimately when I had to pick a thesis for the fund, I said deep tech and big data, because I'm one of those in the field that says that AI can be deep tech as long as you're doing something novel. You're taking certain types of data sets and apply certain types of algorithms that you are improving or even changing themselves. Like, for instance, one company I angel invested last year, they did their very first prototype using OpenAI's API just to prove that it kind of could make sense. But then they ditched that to create their own natural language processing algorithms, and that's the process they're going through now. And to me, that is deep tech because they're using big data in a way which is different from what could just be an off-the-shelf API from, again, OpenAI or something else.
Actually, on that, how do you assess investments within deep tech, especially at the very early stage when you might not be able to see the product behind it at all?
Well, personally, I always do want to see the product, as in, like, we invest as early as pre-seed, but not at the idea stage. And that's pure, literally, to answer that question. As a personal investor, maybe I might give money to someone one day. I don't know if it really convinces me to be a great idea person and I believe in the person, I know the person. I don't know. It hasn't happened yet, but it might. I don't know. But as a fund, I think that, we're not going to go as early as being an incubator. If we're effectively a venture fund, and even as a community, we always invite startups to Silicon Roundabout. At their very beginning, they might have raised no money, but they need to have a product to show. Maybe even just talking about it on the slides, but when we assess them, we want to see that there is something there that is novel. And the only way I can say if something is there novel is because they've built something and they can talk about what they've built and they can show at least a video of it or an actual product. We've had big companies come to our stage that have built hardwares and actually demo it in front of everybody, and that was pretty cool. So,
Do you think then in deep tech you focus a lot more on the product rather than the founders? And the reason I ask this is because a lot of our listeners are Gen Z founders who are incredibly bright, but they might not have had the time to do a PhD or to have very, very extensive credentials.
Good question. Yes and no. I would like to believe that I don't want to be biased by whether one has a PhD or not. I don't know if in practice is the same. You can only be so much self-aware about your own bias. But it is true that just looking at the history of Silicon Roundabout, for example, I've seen about an equal split between founders that are spinning out of universities in some ways or form, not necessarily a direct spin out, but type of thing. And founders, they instead either come from the corporate world and they're now launching their own startup, or they have been in startups, or even have not been in startups, but they have left uni and they've studied something completely different and they now launch a startup. So because of that, I do think that it's not all about a PhD that spins out this sort of doctorate thesis product into a company. I think that is one aspect of deep tech innovation happening. I also believe that there are so many founders that are just not coming from that background. And I genuinely think there has to be a technical person, that's for sure. But technical person doesn't necessarily mean you studied a PhD.
And it's very interesting because a lot more people today, especially part of Gen Z, have access to information which you didn't have 10 years ago, and the internet has, provided that access. So even if you don't have that kind of professional qualification behind you, you probably are able to understand the kind of market and the solution you're trying to build a lot better today than you may have been able to, say, 5-10 years ago. And with that means a lot more kind of deep tech companies are being built by younger people. And on that, do you have any advice for them? First-time founders building something, are going to go raise soon. What would you tell them to do? What's your big tips?
I'm not sure I'm the most qualified person. Maybe a founder would be more qualified. So what I'm going to say is what I've seen other founders do successfully, or even have told me from the successful Silicon Roundabout founders. One thing that I would say is to stay extremely focused, because you will have a very sort of short chance of jumping from the very first round that you might even be able to get on the trust of your team idea, initial prototype from a few angels, and then the early seed, and then the late seed, or just a single largest seed round and the Series A. And you need to realize that investors would look at each round, each phase with certain metrics in mind. And the best way to understand what those metrics are keep speaking to investors just in terms of feedback, and to other founders that have been there, again, in terms of feedback, just so that you understand what each investor at what stage would expect what. Because the worst thing you can do is to lose your focus, build something that is a nice to have and not a must have. And if you do that, you might have 2 features that are good, and maybe even great, but they're not what it's needed to raise the next round, and then you're going to be stuck in limbo. And that's the thing to avoid. You don't want to be stuck in a limbo. that's the one massive tip I provide, is the staying focused, and connected to that is listening to customers, which is normally you think, okay, in deep tech, you might not even have revenue. Are you going to be one of those investors that is all about having big tractions? No, that's not what I mean. But for instance, I've seen companies that may have had similar technology insights and potentially similar good teams in terms of who could build the technology. But I decided to back, or we've seen succeeding companies that had the early conversations, successful conversations, even if it was just a pilot, with the right customers that gave them feedback and managed to inject themselves into the right ecosystems to deliver those projects. And that can be a massive shift, because if you do listen to your customers, even if they're not yet paying customer, they're just a pilot type of customer, it's going to allow you to then improve your focus on what to build and then get to traction eventually, and that's kind of the main focus. You're not going to get away from that just because you're deep tech. And then the last thing, kind of understand where you are in the deep tech spectrum. What I mean is that if you're going out there to build a new type of fusion, nuclear fusion, then literally it's just going to be a pure R&D play. Nobody's going to expect you to have any revenue whatsoever. What you need to deliver is iterative stages of developing a nuclear new fusion reactor. That's pretty much it. Because the thing is that everybody understands that there will be a market, there will be demand. There is already demand, there's just not the product. If you are on the other end to say, building a new machine learning algorithm, that's also deep tech, but you're more in the AI spectrum where you will in the end piggyback on a traditional business of sorts, whether it's a B2B SaaS build, using your algorithm. And then for that, you will need traction. You will need to have good technology, but also you will need traction. Maybe a little bit less so than a traditional vanilla B2B, but then you will need traction. You see, that's an important thing, because sometimes deep tech founders might be got up into this is a great idea, it's an R&D play, but there are different types of R&D plays, and you need to be careful of where you are, because depending on where you are in the spectrum, you might need to deliver more on the R&D versus more on the traction.
Those are really good tips, Francesco. And I especially like your point on making sure that you have interaction and early feedback from customers. Do you have any advice on how to engage with customers and how to get the right response, or what's the right way to approach them for a very early stage deep tech startup?
There are lots of ways. It's just a matter of just getting out there and asking for feedback. That's just inevitable. And it could be that recently I was talking to this founder of great companies, by the way, that I love, that I found out by chance, by seeing the kind of one connecting to each other on LinkedIn, that he's connected to somebody in British Telecom that I also know. And then I was like, you guys should chat. I was like, we actually wrote a paper together. So you see, it might be somebody that you work with academically and now could be a connection because it's in the right corporate. Ask that person for feedback. It might be somebody that is a friend of somebody you went to uni with, if that's the type of demographics you're after. Or it might be also on social media. I mean, that happened to me raising a fund. I started to realize I had to get feedback from investors to understand who my investors were going to be. Again, same thing. There are so many different types of investors, and not everybody's right for my fund, and there's going to be so many types of investors. Not everybody's right for your startup. So trying to find somebody that you would like to have a conversation with and just asking that person could be a good starting point. And then as soon as you have some early prototypes, doing betas, alphas, and then betas, especially if you're a software play, that's a great way to just get early feedback. And I guess that's kind of what I would do.
That's definitely some great advice. And as you mentioned, raising a fund is probably very hard. And, you've just started the process. And I wanted to take a step back because, it's not that common for people to kind of raise a fund off the back of something like a community that you've built. A lot of the time, people who are raising funds, especially emerging managers, are probably either ex-VCs who've kind of already done it themselves within other funds, or they're serial founders themselves and want to kind of stop creating companies and actually invest in some. Firstly, why did you decide to start the fund and not just go get another software engineering job? And secondly, what was the process like once you kind of decided, okay, look, this is what I want to do. How am I going to get there? And what's it been like so far?
The reason why is kind of what I said before, right? That I have this vision that I wanted to help and I wanted to make new type of technologies come to market. And we've had this vision as a community and we just felt there was something more we can do. we thought, well, what's the best thing that putting money where our mouth is? And you're right, because I'm not a CEO founder and I have not been a career VC. I couldn't do it in any other way than, I guess, raising my own fund. So that was just the thing. Okay, so if I wanted to do this, then the only way is to raise a fund. The second question is more like challenging because not coming from that background meant that I had to start from scratch, building a network of investors, and then also validating this, even like figuring out how to do it. And I guess it's been extremely challenging. I mean, very much. I mean, it is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life so far. But I guess the way for now I've been progressing is kind of getting help from people. For example, like I remember reaching out one day to somebody that I was liking his investments, and I could see the company he was investing in, and was Hussein from Roundabout Ventures. And he replied, and then we could have a coffee, and he just explained to me how his VC was working. So I started to take down notes. Okay, so this is how you run the fund. This is follow on versus only doing the first tickets and not leaving for follow on, like this basic stuff that as a fund you would need to know. But I didn't have any clue because I was an engineer. And then figuring out whom to talk to by basically getting loads of no's, lots of private equity firms, for example, that would be open to receive connections, because they're a big company that would say, well, we wouldn't be invested in something small. So then the idea is, okay, so do I raise a big one? Well, no, really, because you need a track record of extensive VC things, so you can't do that either. So you go back to the drawing board, and eventually I landed on sort of a couple of personas, just like a startup would do, Who are the people that are engaging in conversations with me? And it turned out, that there are a few type of profiles. So now I'm just looking to build connections with people to see whether we will fit each other. So it's almost like this, polyamorous relationship. I'm trying to build with as many investors as possible. And that's what every founder does when they raise investment rounds as well.
So you're a founder in your own right, really, because, you're doing it for the first time too. And it's probably a great learning journey. Is there anything you've kind of picked up along the way which you want to share with our listeners in terms of like maybe a really big tip or a big piece of advice that you would have for someone else who wanted to raise a fund for the first time, and something you've learned?
Good question. Trying to find and that's going to be a very, very long journey, trying to find that story that you want to stay true to that is also viable to raise a fund with. And I'm in the process of validating whether it's going to work or not, because like I said, just getting there, it's progressing. So for now, the signals are good. But it took me so long to get this. And then now, for example, basically all of my commitments in terms of people that actually signed a pledge or like we shook hands on investing, it's happened between December 4 months ago and now. But I've been trying to do this thing for 2 years, right? Like I said, from idea to, and the longest part, was actually figuring out what was actually going to work in terms of the persona investors and in terms of the fund. So try to get as much feedback as possible, but ultimately compare these notes and finding the niche that would work for you, because eventually you're going to get to a point, if you stick to this process of feedback, but then comparing feedback and eventually finding also giving your own story, you will find a point where you're able to say, okay, I can take that feedback, I'm not going to take that feedback. And that's a good point. That's a good signal. It's going to take a long time, because a lot of the time you will do wrong things and you need feedback and you need to change. But you need to get to a point eventually to say, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to, for example, take money from a big institutional because it's going to divert me from my thesis. Or I am going to, because it fits with my thesis, and that type of story, type of thing.
No, that's definitely interesting. And I think not just in venture, but also as a founder, storytelling is such a critical skill, and being able to strike the balance between conviction and also listening to other people's feedback. And I wonder, is there any area of deep tech that you think is especially interesting and that everyone should go and learn about?
Yeah, I think semiconductors is extremely underrated, for example. Everything, including software, is built on top of hardware. And we've seen with GraphCore, great success from the UK. I think that's just the beginning. I'm looking at applications of graphene and new materials into semiconductors. And I think Europe has made a massive mistake historically of withdrawing. And now everybody's realized you can't build a house of cards without the table. Semiconductors provide that table. And I think now there is a new shift of attention, and that's going to be great. And another area, for example, is cybersecurity. There's been a lot of great use of AI for threat detections. I think now we're going to see AI being used maybe even threat predictions, and definitely for increased efficiency after the threat has been automatically detected, enhancing the work of teams. And then, of course, energy. I mean, that's almost like, at this point, an easy win. But, of course, you're not going to get there if you don't invest in advanced technologies, right? So there has to be a lot of new innovation and funding and success coming out of new types of energy storage, new type of energy creation, new type of energy transmission. That's just a fact.
Well, the future definitely looks very exciting, but now it's time for our quick fire round. So we're going to give you about 20 to 30 seconds to answer each one of our questions. Are you ready?
Again, let's try.
So my first question is, if you could live anywhere in the world but London, where would it be?
I'm going to say New York, just because I heard great things about it. I've never been there. So I'm just going to shoot for something I've never been to.
If you weren't investing in DeepTech, what other areas would you invest in?
If I say climate is going to be a bit of a cheat, because then I can sneak a lot of the DeepTech back into it. I don't know. I would say, either climate or semiconductors, but that's kind of within DeepTech. So I'm cheating. It's so difficult to sort of get away. Something that has big purpose. So climate or energy, something that has a big purpose and can have a big impact on the future of humanity.
And if you weren't working with startups, what would you be doing?
I don't know. Maybe coding. I love coding at the end of the day, and sometimes I still do it, just, open source projects type of thing. So, software engineering. I do like engineering.
If you could go back in time and tell your younger self one big piece of advice when you first started Silicon Roundabout, what would it be?
Listen to your customers. In the end, that works for startups, that works for funds, and that works for communities. Speak to the people that are coming and they want to like what you're doing, and try to understand what is it that drives them. And there is something there. There is a problem, there is a solution, there is a unique offering, there is something. Find that something.
That's great advice. And finally, if you had one piece of advice for a founder building a deep tech company with just an idea in hand and nothing else, what would it be?
Well, if it's just an idea, you need to try and get some kind of validation. So again, speaking to the right people, and by right people, like I said, it could be anybody, ex-colleagues, it could be early customers. Just trying to get that validation going. If you're generally convinced you have the validation because you have an idea and you've come from the industry or whatever, try to put together the team. That's also validation. Can people come along together with you? If so, maybe there is something because they're following you.
And if I may, Francesco, just one very last question. What's next for Silicon Roundabout and Silicon Roundabout Ventures?
Well, launching, first of all, that would be great. As a fund. As a community, we want to expand. And like I said, the fund is a vehicle that we see as the business soul of the community, so that once it's up and running, we can reinvest back into the community. And so, our marketing budget is probably not going to be spent on going to flashy conferences to find startups, but it's going to be about building the ecosystem that gives us access to startups and help us give back to startups.
Well, it's definitely going to be very exciting, and we're very excited to see it all launch and be in full force. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It was great chatting, and you have some incredible insights that you shared, so I'm sure our listeners have really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for having me again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Next Gen VC, a podcast from Gen Zs to Gen Zs. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the subscribe button and give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram at Next Gen VC Pod for updates on the latest episodes. Are you tired of always hearing about Silicon Valley VCs and not knowing what the greats of European VC are thinking? Well, no more. Head over to theeuropeanvc.com, the go-to place for everything European VC. You'll find podcasts, events, and expert-curated content from all over the EUVC scene. Well, what are you waiting for? Go to theeuropeanvc.com now.